Today we're going over one of the most legendary rivalries in medieval history, Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin, two rulers who spent years trying to defeat each other, while somehow developing a level of respect that sounds less like a medieval war and more like two professional athletes who keep meeting in the final. One was Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, a warrior king famous for his courage, military skill, and absolutely terrible relationship with the idea of staying home and ruling his own kingdom. The other was Saladin, Sultan Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the Muslim ruler who united much of Egypt and Syria and became one of the most famous leaders of the medieval Islamic world. And the interesting part is that these two men were not simply fighting because they personally hated each other. They were fighting over one of the most important cities in the medieval world, Jerusalem. And their rivalry became one of the defining stories of the Third Crusade. So grab your imaginary medieval helmet, make sure your horse has had breakfast, and let's get into it. To understand why Richard and Saladin ended up fighting each other, we have to go back a little. The Crusades were a series of religiously motivated military campaigns involving European Christians and Muslim powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. The First Crusade had captured Jerusalem in 1099, and for almost a century, the Crusader states survived in the region. But by the 12th century, a powerful Muslim leader named Saladin was changing everything. Saladin was born in Tikrit around 1137 or 1138, and eventually rose to become one of the most powerful rulers in the region. He became ruler of Egypt and later expanded his authority across Syria and other territories. But Saladin's biggest achievement was bringing many previously divided Muslim territories together against the Crusader states. Basically, the Crusaders had spent decades dealing with multiple Muslim rulers, and then Saladin showed up and started putting the pieces together. This was going to be a problem. A very large problem. Meanwhile, in Europe, another king was becoming famous. Richard was born in 1157, the son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard was a member of the powerful Plantagenet dynasty, and from a young age he developed a reputation as a warrior and military commander. He also had a reputation for being extremely ambitious. Richard was not exactly the kind of medieval prince who looked at a kingdom and thought, "Nice place, I should probably stay here and manage it." No, Richard wanted adventure, warfare, glory, and apparently every possible excuse to leave England. When his father died in 1189, Richard became King of England. And almost immediately, he started preparing for the crusade. Richard had already taken the cross before becoming king, but now he had enormous resources behind him. He raised money, gathered troops, arranged ships, and prepared to travel east. And this is where things became very interesting. Because Richard was not the only European ruler going on crusade. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was also leading a massive army. And King Philip II of France was preparing to join Richard. This was supposed to be a gigantic Christian military expedition. But medieval history being medieval history, everyone involved had their own ambitions, rivalries, and problems. Frederick Barbarossa died while traveling through Asia Minor in 1190, weakening the German contribution. Richard and Philip eventually reached the Eastern Mediterranean. They joined the Siege of Acre, an important coastal city held by Muslim forces. The siege had already been going on for years before Richard arrived. And then Richard showed up with a large army and immediately became one of the most important commanders there. Acre eventually surrendered in July 1191. But Richard and Philip were already having political disagreements. Philip eventually returned to France, leaving Richard as the dominant European commander in the region. And now Richard had a much bigger problem. Saladin. Saladin had been trying to defend the region and prevent the Crusaders from destroying his power. The two sides finally began moving toward a major confrontation. And if you are expecting Richard and Saladin to walk onto a field, shake hands, and immediately start fighting like two action movie characters, medieval warfare was a little more complicated. Armies had to move. Supplies had to be transported. Horses had to be fed. Water had to be found. Scouts had to gather intelligence. And everyone had to worry about getting ambushed. Richard's army marched south from Acre toward Jaffa. Saladin's forces repeatedly attacked the Crusader column. The situation became especially dangerous because the Crusaders were moving along the coast with the Mediterranean Sea on one side and Saladin's army on the other. Richard responded with disciplined tactics. The Crusaders kept their formation tightly organized, protecting their infantry and cavalry. Their crossbowmen and archers helped defend the formation, while cavalry waited for opportunities to counterattack. Saladin's forces repeatedly harassed them, trying to disrupt the march. But Richard's army continued moving. And then came one of the most important battles of the entire crusade. The Battle of Arsuf. It took place on September 7, 1191. Saladin's army launched a massive attack against Richard's forces. The Muslim troops attacked repeatedly, trying to break the Crusader formation. But Richard maintained discipline. Eventually, the Crusader cavalry launched a powerful counterattack. The Hospitallers and other Crusader forces charged. Richard personally helped coordinate the attack. The Crusaders broke through Saladin's army and won a significant victory. And this is where Richard earned even more of his legendary reputation. The man had basically spent hours being attacked from every direction and then decided, all right, my turn. Saladin's army suffered serious losses and withdrew. But here is something important. Arsuf was a victory for Richard. It was not the end of the war. Richard still had a huge problem. Jerusalem. Richard's ultimate objective was to recover the city. And Saladin's ultimate objective was to keep it. So after Arsuf, Richard continued moving south. He captured Jaffa and strengthened his position. But now we get to the part of the story that makes this rivalry so interesting. Richard was an excellent military commander. Saladin was also an experienced commander. Neither man could simply destroy the other. Richard could win battles, but he could not easily conquer and hold the entire region. Saladin could harass Richard's army and defend the interior, but he could not simply wipe out Richard's forces. Both sides had logistical problems. Both sides needed supplies. Both sides had political pressures. And both sides knew that a disastrous battle could destroy everything. Richard actually approached Jerusalem more than once. But he ultimately decided not to launch a full assault on the city. Why? Because capturing Jerusalem was one thing. Holding it was another. The Crusader army was far from its European bases. The city was inland. Saladin still had forces nearby. And even if Richard captured Jerusalem, Saladin could potentially surround the city and cut off supplies. Richard had to think beyond the glory of simply planting a flag on the walls. This is one of the most important things about Richard. He was not just a fearless warrior. He could also be pragmatic when the situation demanded it. He wanted Jerusalem, but he understood that winning one spectacular battle did not automatically mean winning the entire war. And Saladin understood the same thing. Eventually, Richard withdrew toward the coast. The war continued. There were more battles, raids, negotiations, and political maneuvering. And this is where the two leaders' relationship became increasingly unusual. They were enemies. They were trying to defeat each other. But they also developed a reputation for respecting each other's abilities. Richard became famous in Muslim sources as a powerful and dangerous enemy. Saladin became famous in European sources as a formidable opponent. There are also stories about gifts and diplomatic exchanges between the two sides. Some later accounts describe Saladin sending horses to Richard after Richard lost some of his own. Other stories describe Richard becoming ill and Saladin sending medical assistance. Not every colorful story told about them can be accepted as certain historical fact. Medieval writers loved dramatic stories. But the broader point is clear. Richard and Saladin were capable of negotiating with each other even while fighting a brutal war. This was not friendship. They were not secretly hanging out after battles. It was diplomacy between two powerful enemies who understood that the other man was dangerous. And honestly, that makes the story even better. Imagine spending months trying to destroy someone's army and then sending him a horse because his previous one died. Medieval warfare had some very strange customer service policies. But the war was not all gentlemanly. Both sides committed acts of violence that were completely normal by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. One of the darkest moments came after the surrender of Acre. Richard had taken thousands of Muslim prisoners. Negotiations over the terms of their release and the payment of ransom broke down. In August 1191, Richard ordered the execution of a large number of Muslim prisoners. The exact circumstances and numbers are debated by historians, but thousands were killed. This was a brutal reminder that behind the romantic stories of heroic knights and noble warriors was a very real and bloody war. Saladin also conducted harsh warfare. His armies fought fiercely, and the Crusader states suffered enormously during his campaigns. Yet Saladin's reputation for mercy was strengthened by his treatment of Jerusalem when he captured it in 1187. Unlike the massacre that had followed the Christian capture of Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin generally allowed the city's Christian inhabitants to leave after paying ransoms, although not everyone could afford one and the situation was complicated. He also permitted some Christian religious institutions to continue operating. This became an important part of his historical reputation. And then there was Richard. Richard had a very different personality. He was aggressive, courageous, and extremely confident. He was also not particularly interested in being remembered as a quiet administrator. He wanted military glory, and he got plenty of it. But Richard was running out of time. His kingdom in Europe needed him. His enemies back home were becoming more dangerous. King Philip II of France had already returned home. Richard's younger brother John was becoming politically ambitious. And Richard knew that if he stayed in the Holy Land forever, someone might decide to take his kingdom while he was busy fighting for another one. So Richard began negotiating with Saladin. The negotiations were complicated. Richard wanted access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims and a secure Crusader presence along the coast. Saladin wanted to preserve Muslim control of Jerusalem and avoid giving the Crusaders too much territory. Neither side got everything it wanted, and neither side was completely defeated. Eventually, in September 1192, Richard and Saladin reached a settlement known as the Treaty of Jaffa. The agreement allowed the Crusaders to retain control of a stretch of the coast, including important cities and strongholds. The Crusader kingdom was reduced compared with its earlier territory, but it survived. Christian pilgrims were allowed access to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim control. So Richard did not take Jerusalem, but Saladin also did not destroy the Crusader kingdom. It was basically the medieval version of both sides looking at the scoreboard and saying, well, technically we are still standing. Richard prepared to return to Europe. Before leaving, he reportedly expressed a desire to meet Saladin personally. The two men never actually met face to face. That is one of the most fascinating details of the entire rivalry. They fought the same war. They watched each other's armies. They negotiated through messengers. They exchanged diplomatic messages. They influenced each other's decisions. But Richard and Saladin never stood together in the same room. Instead, they became legends to each other from opposite sides of the battlefield. Richard finally left the Holy Land in October 1192. He had not captured Jerusalem, but he had prevented Saladin from eliminating the Crusader presence along the coast. Saladin had successfully kept Jerusalem, and he had survived a campaign led by one of Europe's most powerful warriors. The rivalry was essentially a draw with different definitions of victory. Richard could say, "I stopped Saladin from destroying the Crusader states." Saladin could say, "Jerusalem is still mine." And both would have had a point. Then history moved on. Richard never returned to the Holy Land. On his journey back to Europe, he was captured by Leopold V of Austria and later transferred to the custody of Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor. Richard was held for ransom for years. His kingdom had to pay an enormous amount for his release. And after returning to his lands, Richard spent much of his remaining life fighting in France. He died in 1199 from a wound received during the Siege of Challis. He was only 41 years old. Saladin did not live much longer after Richard's departure. The great Sultan died in Damascus in March 1193. He was around 55. According to historical accounts, Saladin had given away much of his wealth before his death and did not leave behind the enormous personal fortune that people might expect from one of the most powerful rulers of his age. His empire was also divided among his relatives after his death. So both men eventually disappeared from the political stage. But their reputations only grew. Richard became one of the most famous warrior kings in European history. His reputation as the Lionheart came from his courage and military ability. But there is another side to Richard that is sometimes forgotten. He spent very little of his 10-year reign actually in England. He was a king who was constantly fighting, campaigning, raising money, and dealing with political problems. He also spent enormous amounts of money on warfare. He was a brilliant military commander. But brilliant military commanders do not always make brilliant administrators. Saladin's legacy developed differently. He became one of the most celebrated figures in Islamic history. He was remembered as the ruler who united major Muslim territories and recovered Jerusalem. But modern historians also point out that the real Saladin was more complicated than the legendary figure. He could be merciful. He could also be ruthless. He could negotiate. He could also order severe military actions. He was a politician as well as a warrior. And that is exactly why the rivalry between these two men remains so fascinating. Neither was simply a hero. Neither was simply a villain. They were powerful medieval rulers operating in an incredibly violent political world. Richard was fighting for the Crusader cause and his own reputation. Saladin was fighting to defend Muslim control of Jerusalem and strengthen his political authority. They had different religions, different cultures, different political systems, and completely different backgrounds. Yet they understood something about each other that many of their followers probably did not. They were both extremely capable. Richard knew Saladin could not be underestimated. Saladin knew Richard could not be ignored. And that mutual respect became one of the most memorable parts of their story. There is a reason writers and filmmakers have continued returning to Richard and Saladin for centuries. Their story has everything: war, politics, religion, betrayal, sieges, horsemen, castles, diplomacy, and two commanders who somehow managed to become legends without ever actually meeting. Richard wanted Jerusalem. Saladin refused to give it up. Richard won important battles. Saladin prevented him from achieving his ultimate objective. Richard kept the Crusader kingdom alive. Saladin kept Jerusalem under Muslim rule. And when the dust finally settled, neither man could honestly claim complete victory. That is what makes their rivalry so epic. It was not a simple story where one guy destroys the other. It was a contest between two leaders who were both good enough to stop the other from getting everything he wanted. Richard the Lionheart became the legendary warrior king of England. Saladin became the legendary unifier and defender of Jerusalem. And perhaps the strangest thing about their rivalry is that centuries later, people still talk about both men in the same sentence. Richard became famous for his courage. Saladin became famous for his leadership and generosity. Richard's armies could defeat Saladin's forces in battle. Saladin's strategy could prevent Richard from turning those victories into the conquest of Jerusalem. One could win a battlefield. The other could win the bigger strategic game. And neither one was willing to give the other the satisfaction of total victory. So if you were expecting this story to end with Richard charging into Jerusalem while Saladin dramatically falls from his horse, unfortunately history did not give us that Hollywood ending. Instead, it gave us something much more interesting. Two enemies who fought fiercely. Two rulers who negotiated seriously. Two commanders who respected each other's abilities. And two men whose reputations became much larger than the war they actually fought. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199. Saladin died in 1193. Their armies disappeared. Their kingdoms changed. Their castles became ruins. But the rivalry survived. Because sometimes history does not remember the winner. Sometimes it remembers the two people who were simply too good to completely defeat each other. Richard had the Lionheart. Saladin had Jerusalem. And between them was one of the most legendary rivalries the medieval world ever produced. No final duel. No dramatic sword fight. No winner standing over the other. Just two incredibly ambitious rulers, separated by religion and politics, connected by one enormous battlefield, and forever remembered as the two great names of the Third Crusade. Honestly, considering how much medieval rulers loved killing each other, the fact that these two eventually negotiated a peace agreement instead of fighting until one of them was dead is probably the closest thing medieval history has to a happy ending. And that is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the rivalry that turned two men into legends. Past isn't dead. It's waiting to be told.